All right, I'd like to welcome our next guest speaker, Jessica Henkel, up. Jessica's going to be talking about migratory birds, and also, if you haven't already asked her about this, you should be talking to her about not the migratory birds so much as her recent trip to the Galapagos, where she probably did see a lot of birds. So there are also, field-related questions to ask her there. But the link here now works.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Emily, and thanks everyone for being here. As Emily said, I'm Jessica Henkel. I'm the science advisor for the Gulf Coast Ecosystem Restoration Council. So unfortunately, my day-to-day life these days doesn't actually involve a whole lot of interactions with birds, but in a past life, my dissertation research looked at the migration ecology of shorebirds on the northern Gulf of Mexico. And because I started my PhD studies in the spring of 2010, just a few months before the Deepwater Horizon oil spill actually happened, that necessitated me kind of shifting my research goals from when I first started my PhD to obviously incorporating the effects of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill on the birds that I was studying, and specifically the impacts of the oil spill on the shorebird communities in the northern Gulf. But I would also be happy to talk to anybody at length about the Galapagos because I cannot say enough about it. Okay, just a little background on the migratory bird habitats on the northern Gulf of Mexico, in particular for shorebirds. The beaches and wetlands of the northern Gulf of Mexico are important habitats for 34 species of shorebirds, 28 of which are migratory. And during the non-breeding season, these habitats host more than 5% of the total North American breeding population for 12 of those 28 migratory species. And many of those species rely on the northern Gulf coastal habitats to allow them to fuel up on spring migration on their way to their near Arctic breeding grounds. Unfortunately, these habitats that these shorebirds rely on to fuel their migrations also face persistent threats from both environmental and anthropogenic change. This morning, Sabrina has already talked about, some of the effects of the oil spill and the seaside fires, but also, obviously, those hurricanes also have dramatic impacts on these habitats and also on the birds that utilize them. And unfortunately, the potential threats to shorebird populations using the vulnerable Gulf Coast habitats were compounded when the Deepwater Horizon oil platform exploded and sank, resulting in the death of 11 people and the subsequent oiling of over 2,000 kilometers of Gulf coastlines. Shorebirds were particularly vulnerable to this event as they forage in the readily oiled intertidal shoreline habitat. The oil is washing ashore, and that's right where those shorebirds are foraging. Kendall gave a really great presentation this morning. I was really interested to see her work actually on both the direct effects but also the indirects of oil. As Kendall went over, the direct effects of oil on birds have been well documented. Extreme cases include mortality, often due to a loss of the waterproofing of their feathers, and obviously ingested oil can lead to toxicological effects including hemolytic anemia, immunosuppression, and liver and kidney damage. Unfortunately, for shorebirds, these effects can actually linger longer after the visible oil has been taken away from the beach or removed from the beach, because they're really at risk to continual exposure to the residual oil that can be still remaining in the subsurface, because the shorebird behavior and the way that they feed is by probing into the substrate to find their invertebrate prey. As Kendall also mentioned, oil can also have indirect effects. Those indirect effects can also not only be from ingesting the oil that maybe gets on their feathers, but there can also be a reduction in fitness or overall health of the birds due to a couple of different elements. There could be a decrease in foraging success for the birds, either due to a loss of the actual resources in their habitats because the habitat has become oil and their invertebrate prey has been diminished, or the diversity of the invertebrate prey diminishes. But birds can also experience decreased foraging time, either because they have oil on their feathers, and so instead of foraging, they're spending that time preening their feathers, or, and another key thing we definitely observed was increase in disturbance during their foraging time. Any oil spill ends up resulting in a very large and massive cleanup effort. And that cleanup effort is happening a lot of times, especially for shorebirds, right in the habitats where they're trying to forage and trying to get those fuel stores, especially during spring migration. And I know many of us were out there during this event, during the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and observed this. But when we talk about disturbance, sometimes in some spots we're talking about 100+ ATVs going up and down a beach 4 or 5 times a day, backhoes going up and down that beach. It's a really high level of disturbance, and these habitats of these shorebirds previously were used to having pretty much all to themselves. There's also a developing body of literature on how sublethal or non-lethal exposure to oil within and between seasons can lead to population level impacts through reduced health and reduced reproductive success. Again, Kendall really spoke to this earlier, but I'm not going to go through all the details on this conceptual model here, but essentially the gist of it is that if you have decreased habitat quality at an overwintering or stopover site, that can lead to eventual decreased reproductive success for migratory birds because they're not as fit when they leave their stopover site. Maybe it takes them longer to actually get to their breeding grounds, so they're not there for the optimal time for breeding, or maybe they actually don't make it at all. So, there's this potential for a decreased overall reproductive success of a population due to the effects of oiling in a stopover or wintering habitat. And something I want to point to too is that it's not only within seasons and migration, but also potential re-exposure between seasons. One thing that my dissertation research was able to demonstrate is that some shorebird species show incredible site fidelity to their stopover sites here on the northern Gulf of Mexico. I uniquely banded a suite of sandpipers across both sites in the Gulf, but this is actually a Dunlin that I banded in the spring of 2013 in Dauphin Island, Alabama, that has been resighted every year during spring migration since I banded him. And I was really excited to get this email last year from Andrew Heffenden. Some of you probably know him, who's a big avid birder out in Alabama, and that he had resighted this guy again last spring. So happy to see he's coming back and doing well. But the only thing is that having been out to Alabama every year since then, the sad thing is that the oil is still washing up on its shore. When we have a big hurricane or a storm event, that oil is getting resuspended and washing up on our beaches. And so this little guy is being potentially re-exposed to that oil every he returns. And just an example of this is a photo I took on the 3-year anniversary of the oil spill on Dauphin Island, Alabama, where I banded that guy. And there had been, a strong spring storm the night before, and I come out to do some surveys, and a whole new line of tar balls had just washed up on the beach. So that the oil is still out there and still coming ashore. As we in this room probably know, that the ways of measuring effects of oil on birds can be measured in a variety of ways. One of the traditional ways of measuring an overall impact or on a species is to measure the bird's oiling level, and and we can measure a bird's oiling level just by visually looking at it and saying it has trace amounts all the way up to heavy amounts of oil on it. But in order to effectively evaluate the impacts of the oil spill on shorebirds and look at those more indirect effects, we wanted to identify methods that could potentially measure the longer-term sublethal effects of the oil spill. And as one of the primary factors determining migration speed and success for migratory birds is how quickly they can refuel at a stopover site, fattening rates of birds on migration can potentially be used as a proxy for habitat quality when comparing between stopover sites, as a high refueling rate at a high quality site will allow a bird to continue its migratory journey faster than a bird stopping over at a poor quality site with poorer resources, where it won't be able to get to those higher fuel stores before it is able to migrate. So we can compare habitat quality across sites during spring migration by looking at measures of refueling rates. And one of the simple measures of doing that is just looking at the average fat scores, how much fat a bird is carrying on its body at a site during spring migration. And we do that just by blowing on the bird and seeing how much subcutaneous fat it's storing around its furcula. We can also, of course, weigh these birds. But then we can also look at plasma metabolites. And plasma metabolites are something that are found in the blood plasma that can indicate active fattening in a bird. If I was to go out right now and eat a hamburger, the triglyceride levels in my blood plasma would elevate because of the high level of fat that was in that hamburger. And so essentially we can look at plasma metabolites in birds as an immediate measure of the instantaneous fattening rates. And by comparing those across sites, we could see potentially the difference in refueling quality at a stopover site. So shorebirds provide a really, I think, unique system that allows for the assessment of oil contamination across a coastal landscape, as different shorebird species make subtle but predictably different use in the habitats and microhabitats that they use. For example, sanderlings, which are the little white birds we see running in and out of the tide, of course, are always right there on the edge of the shore. Whereas other species of sandpipers, such as the semi-palmated sandpiper or western sandpiper, tend to forage more in back bay habitats. And so our prediction was that given the way that oil tends to wash ashore, that we would find the more coastal species more readily oiled than what we were determined to be more the estuarine species, the more back bay habitat species, where those habitats were less likely to be oiled. Shorebirds allow for assessment of oil contamination not only across habitats, but also for sampling oil exposure rates across time, as some shorebird species are resident species on the northern Gulf of Mexico, and obviously spending their entire lives here, while other migrants stop over for only a few weeks, and some even just a few days or even one day at a time. And so our prediction was that the longer a species spent on the northern Gulf of Mexico following the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, that its potential for oil exposure would be higher. And of course, particularly for a resident species that we looked at, the Wilson's plover, we predicted that they would have the highest oiling rates. So our study objectives were to quantify exposure across habitats and species using oiling rates and assess the degree to which variation in fuel stores and refueling rates could be explained not only by oiling rates at sites, but also by disturbance rates at those sites. So beginning in October of 2010, birds were banded at 6 sites across the northern Gulf of Mexico, and we identified those sites as heavily oiled, moderately oiled, or unoiled using the maximum oiling rates from the 2010 to 2012 SCAT data from NOAA. And so as you'll see, we ended up having 2 control sites, 2 moderately oiled sites, and 2 heavily oiled sites. And then we also, though, not only looked at the oiling level, but also the level of disturbance at those sites. And we categorized disturbance as birds being interrupted during 30-minute point count surveys using the International Shorebird Survey Protocol, and an interruption counted if the birds stopped foraging and flew greater than 30 meters away during that 30-minute point count survey. One thing I want to point out is that high disturbance levels were actually only observed at sites where we had mechanical cleanup activities taking place, whereas medium disturbance tended to be observed at sites where it could have just, could have been just people on the beach, but generally cleanup activities on the beach where people are walking around with rakes and shovels, but not using the heavy powered machinery. And then light disturbance was actually at our control sites where there was some level of disturbance just from people or dogs on the beach or something along those lines, but it wasn't from actual cleanup activity. And then for one species, the Dunlin, we also measured the variation in fat scores, size adjusted mass, and refueling rates as indicated by those plasma metabolite levels during spring migration. And we also compared those results between the spring of 2011, the spring immediately following the spill, and then the spring of 2012. That was the Dunlin right there. So as I mentioned, we captured our birds at our 6 study sites using mist nets, and once they were captured, we took general morphometric measures. We assessed the visible amount of oil on the bird, and then we also took blood samples for this plasma metabolite analyses. And so looking at results, not surprisingly, we saw more oiled birds at oiled sites, and we saw more oiled birds at the heavily oiled sites versus the moderately oiled. In the first year of our study, 2010 to 2011, out of the 222 birds we captured, 19 of those were oiled, so that's a little over 8.5% of the birds that we captured. And that number dropped much lower in 2011 and 2012, but we were still seeing some trace or lightly oiled birds even more than a year after the spill. One thing I do want to point out is that we did catch an oiled bird at a control site, which is a good reminder, and that was actually St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge, quite a ways away from where the spill had happened. It's a good reminder not only that birds move, but also that oil spills were not only contained to the Deepwater Horizon oil disaster, and that we have continual oil spills happening all over the Gulf where the oil industry takes place. And so not all the effects that we may have seen were directly necessarily tied to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Regarding the species distribution of visibly oiled birds, again, our hypothesis seemed to be carried through, and that the more coastal foraging species had higher oiling rates. But I want to point out that during my study, capturing sanderlings was were like the bane of my existence, and so I only captured 20 centerlings during my study. Also, they weren't my primary focus for the other parts of my dissertation, but I did, at least one out of the 20 centerlings that I captured was oiled. But Dunlin, which tend to be more coastal foraging, had 10 out of 238 had some level of oil, and then it decreased down from there. Interesting and not, again, too surprising, of the resident species, the Wilson's plover was the most oiled shorebird that we did capture. And particularly in the fall of 2010, we captured 5 juvenile Wilson's plovers that had been hatched right at the height of the oil spill, and they all had a trace or light amounts of oiling on them. So when we looked at the effects of the oiling on sites on fuel stores in the birds by their fat score or their size adjusted mass, we saw no relationship between fat scores and size adjusted mass based on oiling rates, which we thought was pretty surprising. And similarly, I will point out actually the very first year, we did see higher fat scores at the control sites versus the heavy site, but those differences were not significant. Similarly, looking at the refueling rates, we did not see a relationship between fat deposition or plasma metabolites and maximum site oil level. Again, though, we saw the slightly higher triglyceride levels at the control site versus the heavy site, but again, also not statistically significant. In comparison with site oil level, though, a clear pattern emerged when we looked at the impact of disturbance level on Dunlin fat scores and refueling rates. Across years, we saw significantly lower fat scores at sites with the highest level of disturbance. This is 2011 as well. Yeah, so, and as well in fat scores and size adjusted mass. But an interesting thing that I thought was really interesting was that we saw that in the high levels of disturbance, but we don't see that same difference between medium and light levels of disturbance, which may indicate that the birds had some sort of threshold of tolerance to disturbance that they were able to tolerate. But those really high levels of disturbance, mechanical work going on the beach, seem to have had an impact on their ability to keep fuel and fat on their bodies. However, another then surprising result, though, was that we didn't see the same response looking at the plasma metabolite levels. We actually saw almost no real difference there, observable difference in the triglyceride levels. This was surprising to me because if you see a difference in fat scores and weight, right, but you're not seeing that difference in refueling, that doesn't really seem to make any sense. But one suggestion and one thing that I observed just being out there, even in those heavy disturbance sites, was that at the end of the day, the birds would be foraging away from where there was mechanical cleanup happening, say a bulldozer, pulling up the tar mats. The second those machines shut down at 5 p.m. and all the workers left at the end of the day, the shorebirds that were foraging 100 meters away oftentimes would fly right over to where that cleanup had been happening and start foraging really actively right there. Likely because those bulldozers were pulling up and exposing the substrate that probably had a lot of invertebrates in it, and it was a good little smorgasbord for the birds. So maybe their refueling rates actually were not any different. They were getting the fuel they needed. But potentially, because of the disturbance, they're then also having to fly around to avoid that activity during the day, potentially enabling them not be able to keep that fat on their bodies. So they were generating it, but then losing it. So kind of in conclusion, given that greater than 1 million shorebirds migrate through the northern Gulf of Mexico annually, and that we saw 8.6% of shorebirds oiled in 2011, you do the numbers and the math looks to as many as 100,000 shorebirds potentially being affected by the oil spill, at least with direct oiling. We saw that species variation and contamination, again, the more coastal species being more readily oiled, and the resident species having the largest percent of visible oiling. And then looking at the indirect effects of oil, we did again see the fattening rates, high fattening rates at all sites, but fuel stores varying with the high disturbance rates leading to lower fuel stores. And I think that these analyses are really important for helping us to think, through when we're developing response plans for cleanup activities, to take the ecological implications into consideration. And I'm in no way advocating for not cleaning up after an oil spill, but I think that what I observed regarding heavy disturbance and heavy cleanup activity is that, if there could be a response plan where cleanup is only happening at certain portions of the beach during periods of migration, that's one way to deal with that. Or if it doesn't happen during main foraging times for these birds, you know, dawn and dusk, obviously are great times for the visibly foraging, and just something for us to take into consideration moving forward. And with that, I'll take any questions.
They have questions.
Oh, because I'm too late.